verhalen worden verteld aan de hand van een paar vragen. Wie, wat, waar, wanneer en waarom. Maar wij beantwoorden de belangrijkste vraag van ze allemaal. En dat is whisky?
Ja, graag. Maar mag ik vandaag misschien een paar wensen uitspreken?
Oké, laat maar zo.
Oké, allereerst.
Oh god.
Ik zou graag een Highland willen vandaag.
Oké, ja, gaan we doen.
Een leuke, bijzondere, experimentele Highland.
Ja, oké.
Lekker niet zoet, maar wel een beetje rooks, een beetje rokerig ondertoontje.
Oké, ja.
En dan zou het zo leuk zijn als we een interview konden krijgen met iemand die betrokken is bij die whisky.
Nou, Lucia, laat ik precies dat hebben.
Nee, echt?
Dit is zo goed geïngestudeerd, dit. We hebben het over de...
Surprise Pikachu face.
Ja, we hebben het natuurlijk over de Cù Bòcan. En dat is een experimental lightly peated Highland malt whisky. Nou, en als dat nog niet genoeg was voor al jouw mensen, gaan we ook nog een telefoontje hebben met de goede man Scott Adamson. Hij is brand ambassador bij deze hele mooie distilleerderij. Jullie zien namelijk achter mij, als je op YouTube kijkt, 2 flessen. De Cù Bòcan en de Tomatin. Nou, dan, hoe zit dat? Nou, dat gaat Scott dadelijk haarfijn uitleggen. En dit is de eerste keer volgens mij dat wij een Skype-call hebben, een gesprek, waar wij beide met de personen doen. Dus dat is ook hartstikke leuk. Nou, heb jij podcastabonnement en heb je er zin in? Pak een buisje erbij, schenk hem in. En heb je er geen zin in? Ja,
doei.
Succes het komende uur. Nou, veel plezier bij deze aflevering. Wij hebben er zin in en hopelijk jullie ook. Nou, gaan we!
Welcome to our podcast of the elements of whiskey. Today we have a very, very special guest. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, guys. I'm Scott Adamson. I'm the global brand ambassador at Tomatin Distillery, and that means that I cover all of our brands, including Cù Bòcan that we're going to talk about today. And I also work on the cask selection blending side of things, so have a front row seat in how these products are made as well. So really looking forward to sharing a dram and chatting to you about them.
So this delicious, I assume, delicious dram, which I see now has no sticker on it for me. Thank you, Max. Cù Bòcan, you said, and it has your fingerprints on it then.
It does a little bit, yeah. So I'm very fortunate. Cù Bòcan at its core is quite an experimental single malt brand, and I'm allowed to get involved in that, from selecting the cask types that we're going to mature the spirit in, and then picking how we're going to marry those cask types together to get the best single malt possible. But Signature that we're trying today, Signature has been in production since 2005, and we first launched it in 2013. So the recipe here, the whiskey that we're going to try here, that predates my time there, but I'm still involved in bringing that to life.
That's lovely. It smells very good. I'm already sniffing a bit. But before I try it, I want to get some questions in first. So Cù Bòcan is a very unusual name for what apparently also is an unusual spirit. Where does this name come from? Do you know?
Yeah, so the name came from a local kind of myth. In Gaelic, Cù means dog and Bòcan means spirit or ghost, and there is a local myth that a ghost dog haunts the local area. Now, when we first launched the brand, that was a big part of the story, but now since we rebranded in 2019, the focus is now far more on the liquid inside the bottle, and we just use that Cù Bòcan name as part of the legacy of the brand.
I love it. I love dogs. I love stories. I love mythology. We've done a bunch of episodes on that previously, so I love this whiskey even more now. And also, as our audience can see here, there is this beautiful bottle with this very nice, intricate design. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we rebranded Cù Bòcan in 2019. And what we wanted to do was, Cù Bòcan is a lightly peated single malt. And I think our old packaging, it was a black box with a big puff of blue smoke on the front. I think it maybe conveyed that the whiskey within was a heavily peated single malt, and that wasn't really doing the liquid justice. So in 2019, when we went through the rebrand process, we wanted something that told the story of the liquid inside the bottle. So first of all, as you mentioned, it is beautiful, as is the whiskey inside. But what we're trying to do with the design here is kind of show that interaction between smoke and oak. And there's this lovely thing when you turn the bottle round slowly, it does look like that little light touch of smoke is going up. And then the lines on the bottle are to reflect the influence of oak on our whiskey. One of my favourite elements of the packaging, though, is actually on the carton itself. And I don't know how well everyone can see this that's viewing, but there are small little black specks throughout the substrate of the packaging. And that was our designer in Edinburgh got a hold of a briquette of peat and they pulverized it into small particles so that it could be laid throughout the packaging, which is really, really cool. My favourite bit about that was when a designer from Edinburgh was trying to source Highland peat, and all they could find was people looking to sell them pallets of the stuff that would last in a fire for months. And he was just saying, no, I need one brick of peat. So I had to go and source that and send it down to them.
All right. So I've been smelling a bit. I like it. It's nice. It's a bit grassy, a bit flowery. It's very soft, very sweet.
Yeah, so what we have here, this is Cù Bòcan's signature, and this is the single malt that the brand in many ways has been built around. So a little bit of the backstory is we only first started making peated spirit back in 2005. And when we first produced that, our distillery manager filled some bourbon barrels, some virgin oak casks, and some Oloroso sherry casks. So 8 years later in 2013, when we wanted to release a product from this peated spirit, the best place to go was to those original 3 cask types, marry them together and create this recipe. So what we have here, there is that little gentle touch of smoke. It is, for me, the way I like to describe it is the smoke is not the main ingredient. It's like the seasoning that pulls all the other flavors together. It's like the salt and pepper on the dish. The bourbon barrels give a huge waft of that lovely sweetness, that vanilla, that coconut really comes through there. The virgin oak adds a little bit more spice, particularly on the palate. And then the sherry almost gives us like a smoked paprika and some dried fruits coming through. But it's a surprisingly sweet spirit for something that is made with lightly peated barley.
It's very nice. And indeed, the smoke comes through at the very end, I feel. Barely in the smell, in the taste it does. It's very subtle. It's indeed, it's the garnish on the on the whiskey, so to say. And
Absolutely.
I've heard that this is the only spirit in your core range. Is that right?
Yeah, so with Cù Bòcan, we have Signature, which is our only core ongoing expression in the brand at the moment. But around that, we have a series of limited batch releases called the Creations. And so as I mentioned, Cù Bòcan at its core has been about experimentation. We take that lightly peated barley, we distill it for only 1 week in the winter. That gives us our new make spirit. And then we put it into a wide variety of different casks. And the 3 main casks are still the bourbon, the virgin American oak, and the sherry that we use for Signature. But around that, we have access to some of the most incredible and rare casks in the world that we can then create limited products from. So Creation 1 and 2, which were launched in 2019 at the time of the rebrand, really typify that. So Creation 1 uses Cù Bòcan that's been matured in imperial stout casks from the Black Isle Brewery, which is a local brewery to us, and
Nice.
Moscatel casks from a winery in Portugal. So it's this mixture of sweet dessert wine with lots of orange flavors and then that bitter hoppy beer, and it works wonderfully well together.
That
And then
sounds
Creation
wonderful.
2, it's fantastic. For me, it's a whiskey that reminds me of my honeymoon. We went on honeymoon to Rome, and every morning we stayed in a bed and breakfast, and we would go downstairs every morning and have our breakfast on one of the busy streets in Rome, just sitting at a little cafe. And every morning we would have a double espresso and a pastry with like an apricot jam in the middle. And it was that mixture of that jam marmalade flavour, the sweet buttery pastry, and then that bitter espresso. It just really takes me back to that in Creation 1 there.
Nice.
And then Creation 2, we became the first distillery in Scotland to use Japanese shochu casks. So that was a really cool thing as well.
That sounds nice. That sounds very cool. Hey, Max, can we get one of those nice Creation 1 bottles, perhaps?
This means that I need to go shopping again?
It does. Are they still available, Scott?
They will be coming towards the end of their kind of time. You might still be able to find them in some specialist retailers, but we are about to, on the 24th of January, launch Creation 3 and 4. So with it being the new year, it's almost a little bit of that out with the old, in with the new type of thing going on with Cù Bòcan right now.
All right. Looking forward to those then, if they are in any way as nice as the Creation 1 and 2 sound. And
they're certainly as interesting, and I'm very fortunate. I've got a bottle of each of them on front of me right now. It's already produced, it's in package waiting to go out. But with Creation 3, we're using some Moroccan red wine casks, and we're mixing those casks with American rye. So it's really this taste of Morocco. It's that red fruits from the wine, and it's the spices from the rye casks. So really, really exciting there. And then Creation 4 is two of Europe's most revered drinks. It's port and cognac casks married together. So with Cù Bòcan, we're almost taking, for the last 10, maybe even 20 years, the whiskey industry has experimented with a wide variety of cask types. But what we're doing with Cù Bòcan is taking the information we've learned over that time and then marrying the flavours together. So rather than just showing what one cask type can do, it's how can we use that flavour and what can we marry it with? And it kind of goes back to what we did with Signature with the 3 cask types, trying to get the better flavour, try and create something that is better than the sum of its parts.
That sounds amazing. That sounds wonderful. You mentioned something about distilling only 1 week in winter. So is that like your Christmas gift, or how does this work? Why do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So just for clarity, Cù Bòcan is produced at Tomatin Distillery, and Tomatin Distillery has been producing since 1897. And interestingly enough, up until the 1960s, the vast majority of the spirit made at Tomatin would have been peated. But then from the 1960s onwards, and that goes for the Highlands as a whole, from the 1960s onwards, there was a massive move away from smoky spirits in the Highlands and Speyside into that light, fruity style that Tomatin is now known for. And Tomatin is absolutely the big brand that is our core brand. And so we produce that all year round. But then since 2005, we've dedicated the last week of production every year to laying down this lightly peated spirit. And the reason that we do it in winter is because the water at that time of the year is so much colder, and it allows us to create a slightly more oily, more viscous body of spirit, which works really well with that sort of smoky, peaty thing going on there. So so for the last 1 to 2 weeks every year, we'll turn production from Tomatin to Cù Bòcan.
Nice. That sounds really cool. And I think Max will go into that later with you a bit, the comparison in production process between Tomatin and Cù Bòcan, because the two differ, I understood.
They're massively different the whole way through.
And those details in distilling, in only using this 1 or 2 weeks in winter, a very set time, using a different process, is that also why it is such an unusual spirit then?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going into that. So I think the first one, that time of year is massively important, and I can't think of many distilleries that only make a spirit for 2 weeks of the year and then do something else for the whole time. So that's quite unusual.
Me
but
neither.
I think what is unusual at its core is that nowadays most Highland spirits are not peated. Most Highland spirits are quite fruity, are quite elegant, are quite rounded. So bringing back that kind of historical distillation process, and as I'm speaking to Max, we'll jump into that in much more detail, but bringing back that historical style of production, but then marrying that with a very, very modern approach to maturation. I think that's where the unusual lies. It's this marriage of history and really up-to-date maturation.
I like that very much. I like how you're sort of paying homage to the history of the Highlands and the distillery. I just have a few more questions before you can get all geeky with Max about the whiskey. The distillery itself, so you are the brand ambassador. Are there any other, of course there are other people on board on the distillery. You don't run it by yourself. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Who is the distillery manager?
Absolutely, yeah. So the distillery is located 15 miles to the south of Inverness, and geographically it puts
no way.
right. Yeah. right in the heart of the Scottish Highlands. So it's a really interesting place because it was the first distillery in the Highlands that was built away from the coast. It was built in 1897 as the Highland Railway line was completed. So rather than needing the water to get your whiskey to the market, we used the railway, and it means that we're 315 metres above sea level, right in the heart of the Scottish Highlands. The problem with that is that most Highland communities are coastal. So when the distillery was built, the founders had to build a handful of cottages on site as well. And as the distillery expanded, so has the number of houses. So Tomatin today is the last distillery in Scotland that still provides accommodation for all of its workforce, well, for the majority of its workforce. So more than half of the people that work at the distillery live on site. Across the company, I believe the team is about 60 people, and that's everything from production to the visitor centre to sales and marketing, all the way up to the managing director. And we're based at the distillery. Our head office is on site at the distillery. So there's this real connection with the spirit, both from a work point of view and also from a community point of view. And so, yeah, our master distiller is a gentleman called Graham Unson. Graham originally started his career in 1990 at Scapa Distillery. He then moved to Glendronach. From Glendronach, he moved to Glenmorangie, and he became the distillery manager at Glenmorangie for a decade. He's responsible for reopening Glenglassaugh Distillery. He brought that back to life. And then in 2011, he came to Tomatin, and he's now our master distiller. And so from him, it's this trickle down. We've got the production team, we've got the warehousing team, we've got our own cooperage on site. There's myself working as the brand ambassador, but we've got a marketing team, a sales team, all based at the distillery at Tomatin.
Nice, that's very nice. And so there's a bunch of cottages on site. You said a couple of the workers are housed there. Do they bring their families, or is it like a student commuting to and from their family on the weekend? Or
no, it's that becomes people's home for their life.
Oh, wow.
So we have 30 cottages at the distillery, and they're all occupied by production workers and their family. And the great thing about that is that, unlike some places where people maybe go and work there for a couple of years to bolster their CV and move to somewhere else, these people will stay at the distillery their whole life. So we've got members of staff who have been working with us for 45 years, 40 years, 30 years. Their sons and daughters work in the distillery, and their cousins work in the distillery. So it really is this kind of a community that just happens to centre around a distillery, which is really cool.
I love that. That's amazing. Max, we need to move to Scotland. I'm kidding, don't worry. I think from my side, those are all my questions. Anything else you want to talk about before you go on chatting with Max?
No, I think let's get into the nitty gritty, into the details now.
All right, I'll let you two have fun then.
All right.
Thank you.
Hello, Scott. So now it's my turn to have a little chat with you. Lucia is also very interested in the whole story behind the distillery itself and the whiskey. But to be honest, I'm going to make it a little bit harder for you and just give you some harder questions. I just really want to talk really quickly through the whole process of your making whiskey, and I want to have all the little details about it because I'm interested, because I'm always wondering if I hear stories okay, we distill only the last week in winter or in the year, and I'm like, this is very cool as a storytelling perspective, but does it actually do anything? So that's some stuff that I want to talk about with you. I just want to really know which is storytelling and which actually involves changes the flavor. So we start with the water. You said the temperature of the water is a very important part. Why is it?
So what will happen there in the winter, the water is just above freezing point the whole time. Okay. And throughout the year, the temperature of our water source is a soft water source. It is a surface water source. It's a stream called the Altna Frith. Okay. So it is exposed to the elements. It lands on the mountains just above the distillery and then comes down to the distillery. So in the summer, when it's hot outside, that water will be warmer. Okay. In the winter, especially in December when we make the stuff, that water is just above freezing point. Now, where that comes into importance in the production of Cù Bòcan is in the condensers. So as we're distilling and the vapor has traveled up over the neck of the still and out through the line arm, it comes into the condenser unit. And we're using shell and tube condensers there. Okay. And because the water that is going into that shell and tube condenser is so much colder, it means that the vapor condenses quicker than it would if the water was warmer.
Yeah, exactly.
And what that allows to happen is to create a slightly heavier, slightly more oily spirit at the end, because it's condensed quicker.
All right, so it's mostly in the condensing part, because like I was wondering, like if you're going to make your mash, you actually are using warm water. No matter what the water source is, you need to heat it up to extract all the sugars and enzymes of it. So like, why would you use cold water? But it's in the condensing part. I will get back to distilling because that's way later on in the line.
Of course.
You also are proud to say like we use Scottish barley. This is very, very important because like we know that like a lot of very big brands with like a big production capacity need to buy like from the mainland, like buy barley. So you guys use 100% Scottish barley.
Yeah.
How much do we know about this, like the barley, or like where it came from? Or is it like you also like sort of buying it in bulk? Or do you exactly know which farmer planted the seeds at which point?
Yeah, so we work on long contracts with our barley supplier, which is Simpsons down and Simpsons and Baird's, two different suppliers. We work with both of those guys. Right. And so because of those long contracts and because of their traceability, we are able to, if we wanted to, look at a batch of barley, look at the reference code that we have on it and go all the way back to seed and know exactly what has been used on that field, which is really important. But what's really cool about Cù Bòcan now, especially this year, so up until this year, we have used the kind of the barley variety that's been used for single malt production at the time. So it would be things like Concerto or Laureate. Yeah. This year, for the first time, Cù Bòcan was produced 100% with Golden Promise.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Golden Promise is one of these heritage barley varieties. And so we know that this barley has been grown on farms just to the north of Dundee, on the east coast of Scotland, because we had to source from a farmer that is still producing Golden Promise.
All right. Like for our Dutch-speaking audiences, we did an episode completely talking about grains and like all the different strains. In this episode, we also looked at yields, like how much pure alcohol we get from how much like tons of like barley. Golden Promise isn't exactly the one which you should use if you want to get a really nice big batch, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, it's true enough. So the way barley has developed is, I think something that is at the core of whiskey production has always been striving for efficiency. It's maybe not the most romantic thing, but that has been at the core of whiskey production since at least 1823, when the kind of the rules of how a distillery should run have been set out. And a big part of that is getting the maximum yield from your tonnage of barley. So it's litres per tonne is the way we calculate it. You're normally looking between 400 to 420 litres of alcohol per tonne of barley as your yield. Golden Promise, being a heritage barley variety, should give us some problems in that. And when we were going through the process of selecting it, we did a cost analysis and kind of outlined how much more it's going to cost per litre. Firstly, on the fact that Golden Promise per tonne is more expensive than these modern varieties because there's only so many places that grow it. And then secondly, on the fact that we're going to lose alcohol because of the lower yield. Yeah. I was speaking to our distillery manager just before we closed for the holidays there, just as the Cù Bòcan production came to an end, and she was blown away by how good the Golden Promise had performed. I think she was talking about 408 litres per tonne. So oddly enough, I don't know what's happened. I don't know how the distilleries, maybe there's a calculation gone wrong, but it's looking like that this has performed really, really well from a yield perspective. But more importantly, for a brand like Cù Bòcan, it's performed exceptionally well from a quality point of view. Okay. It has this lovely mouthfeel. It's got this real depth of malty characteristics. So it's giving us a lot.
All right. What I'm just wondering right now, we are talking about a lightly peated whiskey. Lightly doesn't like it. Yes, it's not extremely heavily peated. Okay, but what is your definition of a lightly peated? And in size of like transparency and like knowing stuff, do you guys measure like stuff like the fennel ppm or stuff like that? And what is a lightly peated Highland
Yeah,
whiskey?
so I think it's interesting because I think we've got to go back and look at what ppm is. And ppm is the parts per million of phenols in the barley. And phenols are this family of flavor compounds. So you'll get aromas like smoke, you'll get maybe that medicinal side, and they all come under this phenol banner. And ppm measures that, how many of those
Compounds
are per million. Yeah. And that's all great. That tells you what's in the barley. But what that does not tell you is the fact that every distillery performs differently.
Yeah.
And so something that would be considered heavily peated at one distillery might not be so heavily peated at another distillery. And I'll give you a great example. So when we first started making Cù Bòcan and distilling this spirit back in 2005, the barley that we were buying was coming in at 15 ppm, 1.5. And I would say that is a lightly peated barley. I would say for me, anything between like 2 and 20 is quite light.
Yeah.
And we used that barley all the way up until 2012. And then we decided to experiment with the barley peating and find out, what happens if we do 40 ppm? What happens if we do 30 ppm? And we've done that. And what's really incredible is that 40 ppm is where I would start to get to heavy. That's where you're getting to the numbers of likes of Lafroig and Lagavulin and Ardbeg, maybe a little bit higher for them.
Yeah.
But it's around about that. You're getting into that ballpark. What was really interesting is in the spirit, that smoke, that peat does not come across at our distillery. And I think the reason for that is what we're effectively doing is making a lightly peated whiskey in a distillery that is designed to create a light, fruity, floral spirit. So the distillery is designed to create Tomatin, and Tomatin is a light, it's an elegant, it's a very complex spirit, but at its core, it's fruity. So when we then run peated barley through it, whether it's 15 ppm or 40 ppm, the still shape, the way we run the still, it's designed to remove a lot of those heavier flavor compounds, which phenols are. Yeah. So even when we produce something that's 40 ppm, if we were to take that barley and take it over to Lafroig, they would create a much heavier spirit than we do. So I don't think ppm of barley is a fair way to really assess how peated or non-peated a whiskey will be. So for us, we go purely by nose and taste, and that's difficult because it's not empirical. There's not a number. True. And it would be great to be able to say, okay, this is level 1 peat, level 2 peat, level 3 peat, level 4, level 5. Unfortunately, we don't do that because it's so subjective as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because the thing is, I like to consider myself as one of the peat heads. Really are looking for this very densely heavy peat smoke, where it's always like the higher the number, the better. But pretty recently, there is a distillery that I've noticed that put 2 ppm levels on their bottle. The first being the ppm level in the malted barley, and also a ppm level from the final product, or at least from the new make spirit. And this gives me like this very helpful insight that you lose a lot of these high numbers, these high values when distilling, and as you mentioned, like the shape of the still and the way you distill it changes this. But are there any experiments being done by blending different ppm levels? Do you know anything about like what is happening when I take a very lightly peated whiskey and a very highly peated whiskey and I combine them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think to illustrate that, the Cù Bòcan Creation 2 is a great example.
Okay.
So Creation 2 is a combination of 2 cask types. It's 85%, roughly 85% matured in those Japanese shochu casks, and that was spirit that was laid down in 2012.
Okay.
So 2012 was the last year of that 15 ppm. The final 15% is European virgin oak from 2014, and in 2014 our ppm was around about 30 to 35 ppm. So it's twice the peat content of the 2012 spirit.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that this is absolutely the quote unquote smokiest Cù Bòcan that we've released. That doesn't mean that it's a heavily smoky whiskey. It's relative to the fact that everything's quite lightly peated, but you get that coming across more. What I find interesting though is trying those two spirits side by side, I'm getting more smoke from the lightly peated barley, the 2012 15 ppm, than I am from the 2014 30 ppm. And the reason is the cask type. So Japanese shochu, those are casks that have held another spirit. There's not a huge amount of oak influence. So what you're getting is the development of the spirit.
Yes.
Whereas with the European virgin oak, you get this massive assault of flavor from the wood itself, so that it almost masks the smoke. So
all right.
Even if you talk about that two different levels of peat, the thing to bear in mind is the interaction of the different cask types we're using as well.
Okay, you've mentioned it, and we'll get back to the second part of like making the whiskey. But you mentioned this briefly. There are two new creations been released, I believe, 2 weeks ago. Please tell me, like creation 3 and 4. These are the new ones? To give a little peek behind the curtains, of course, we record this before the moment, so I don't have a bottle sitting here next to me, which, Scott, is a shame. We need to do something about that. But what is the Creations 3? What is that about?
Creations at their core are all about making flavor, and they're all about finding the individual flavors that different cask types will give us, and then blending them together in a way that gives us something that really completes them. So Creation 3, I have it here, and you'll see tremendous color of whiskey as well. Wow. All natural color, all non-chill filtered, all 46%. What we've done here is we've used a combination of Moroccan Cabernet Sauvignon casks. So red wine from the Fez region of Morocco, French oak casks that have held Moroccan red wine, and those have given us wonderful red berries, almost like a strawberry with a balsamic glaze kind of flavor. Really interesting.
My wine canvas isn't, like, my wine knowledge isn't this big, but what makes a Moroccan wine stand out from like a French or an Italian or an European red wine?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I'm not the biggest wine knowledge guy myself, and I've not spent a huge amount of time drinking Moroccan wine.
Right.
But it's those Cabernet Sauvignon grapes produced grown in Morocco with that different soil type, different climate, but it's still Mediterranean, you know. So if you look at Spain and Italy, they're on the Mediterranean. Morocco is as well. It just happens to be in Africa.
Yeah, true.
So, you know, trying the Moroccan red wine casks, for me, there was a lightness to them compared to French Cabernet Sauvignon casks that I've used in the past. Now, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what the wine is like. It's just what the spirit coming out of those casks did. So for me, there was a rose water and that strawberry element from the Moroccan red wine casks that really worked incredibly well with the Cù Bòcan spirit. And then that kind of gave us a thought, you know, can we create the flavors of a Moroccan souk, you know, those Moroccan markets in a whiskey? And so we thought, well, what do they have? They've got all these red fruits that we have from the Moroccan wine cask, but something they have in abundance is spice. Yeah. And we thought, where better to get a spicy element into our whiskey than from American rye casks? Yeah. And American rye has all of these lovely spice-driven notes. And so we've used those casks in here as well. We've married that rye and Moroccan wine to give that overall impression of walking through a market in Morocco.
Really interesting. But that is only number 3. We also got number 4?
We've also got number 4, yeah.
You have the bottle in front of you?
Yeah, I've got this one in front of me as well. Number 4. Again, beautiful liquid here. So number 4 is something we'd been kind of thinking of for a while. We wanted to have a Cù Bòcan that used port casks. We love port casks. It works really well with all of the spirit that we produce. And we worked with the Symington family over in Portugal for our port casks, and it's tawny port pipes that have held port for around about 50 years before they get to us. So huge amounts of flavor there, and in this spirit it gives us almost like a plum jam, and there's like almost like a spiced chocolate flavor from the port matured whiskey. And then to that we've added cognac casks, that classic French spirit cognac casks are something we've really only been experimenting with for the last 10 years.
Okay.
But the results have been incredible. Lots of floral flavors, lots of freshly baked kind of pastry notes coming from those casks as well. And what's really cool is I was reading an old cocktail book called Jigger, Beaker, Glass. And there's a cocktail in there called the Antrim cocktail.
Okay.
And the Antrim cocktail is very simply a mix of cognac and port together. And we thought, we can do that with these casks and create the trifecta of drinks, Scotch whiskey, cognac, and port, tawny port. Just, it all sounds beautiful. And when we got the recipe right, when we got the contents right, we were blown away by the results.
I'm really looking forward on these new creations, but I want to get back to the matter at hand, making this whiskey. We've talked about the water, the malted barley, and the peat. Something that I think that is quite often overlooked is the usage of yeast and fermentation, or at least it's not overlooked because it's I imagine for you guys a very important part, but it's not something that is discussed that often. So let's change that up a little bit. What do you can tell me about like the yeast and fermentation times, and also like how you guys been experimenting with it, or that it's just basically just using the knowledge you have from making whiskey the rest of the year and just carrying it over just to have this solid base. Like which way do you swing?
I think that's you're absolutely right. It's a part of the discussion that, if you go to a winery in France, one of the things they talk about the most is the fermentation.
Yep.
And you come to Scotland where you have 150 distilleries and they all use the same 3 ingredients, but we only talk about 2 of them. But I think yeast itself is absolutely important. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, distilleries are all using a distiller's yeast. Mm-hmm. At Tomatin, we're using MG plus Mauri yeast. It's a distiller's yeast. Mm-hmm. But what I think is really important is to separate the yeast that we use and the process of fermentation. Okay. Because yeast is one microorganism. Mm-hmm. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, to give it the full name, is one microorganism. Mm-hmm. And the goal of that microorganism is to consume the sugars that exist in our wort from the mash and convert them into alcohol. But as well as that, you'll get congeners, so flavor compounds, you'll get heat, and you'll get carbon dioxide. Yeah. But what we're trying to do as distillers is use the yeast to hijack the sugar and create alcohol. Mm-hmm. Now, that function of yeast creating alcohol, that finishes at 48 hours. Okay. At that point in time, the yeast cells start to die, and they'll go away. Now, in that first 48 hours, the yeast is the dominant microorganism in the fermentation. It is leading the dance. It's doing everything. Mm-hmm. But there are hundreds and thousands of other microorganisms in that liquid, and they will be suppressed for that first 48 hours. But as the yeast dies, they start to flourish and they start to have their own little interactions. Mm-hmm. And at Tomatin, and it extends to Cù Bòcan production, we have the longest standard fermentation in Scotland. Our fermentation is 1 full week long, so 7 days. And I believe that is around about 168 hours, if my maths is correct. But it's a long period of time, For most people, when they talk about a long fermentation, they're talking about 80 to 100 hours. So ours is twice as long as a long fermentation. Mm-hmm. And during that time, all of these other microorganisms are allowed to interact and develop chemicals and flavor compounds, and they will change the flavor of the wash. And what we get is this, it's called late lactic acid bacteria, and they create incredibly fruity flavors in the wash. Mm-hmm. So just before we shut down for the end of the year, I was down at the distillery while we were making Cù Bòcan, really, really excited to see how this golden promise worked. So I was speaking to the mash guys, and they were saying that it was thicker, but it was draining well, so that was all good. Mm-hmm. Then went through to the tun room, and I was able to try one of the washes at that 48-hour mark, and it was very, very barley led. It was very malty. It had that kind of silagey, funky barley flavors, which are really lovely. I then tried it at 150 hours. And do you remember when you were a kid going to the beach and you would get a Solero ice lolly?
Yeah.
That passion fruit ice lolly, that passion fruit and vanilla. As soon as I opened the wash back up, that was the flavor that I was met with. This massive burst of tropical fruit with the smoke. It was almost like if you were to take some pineapple and put it on a barbecue.
Yes.
That was the smell that we were getting off the washback. And that is all because of this long fermentation that we use.
And you say like it's like you ferment like 7 days like long. How many like fermentation tons do you guys have to facilitate all these? Like, because I can't imagine like you wait 7 days until perhaps something happens. Hey Bob, ik heb gehoord dat jij een leuke training gaat geven hier in Heerlen.
Ja, dat klopt. Ik kom hier bij jou aan de overkant van de gang de Whisky Ambassador cursus geven.
Hartstikke leuk. Nou ja, goed. Ik heb al met vlag en wimpel ben ik geslaagd. Heb ik hier op een papiertje staan. Maar voor de mensen thuis die nog niet weten wat het is. Wat is de Whisky Ambassador training?
De Whisky Ambassador training is een training van een dag.
Okay.
En tijdens die dag leer ik je alle basisdingen, alle basisweetjes over whisky. Heel specifiek over Schotse whisky. Over de geschiedenis. Hoe wordt het gemaakt? Productie gaan we heel erg uitgebreid in. We gaan het heel erg uitgebreid hebben over geuren en smaken. We gaan het heel erg uitgebreid hebben over de plaats van Schotse whisky in de wereld en in Schotland. En we gaan proeven, uiteraard. Niet onbelangrijk. Technisch proeven.
Dit is het spannendste gedeelte van de dag,
toch wel, hè? Nou, eigenlijk is het spannendste gedeelte dan uiteindelijk het examen. Want
dat hoort
aan
er
het
bij.
eind van de dag gaan we examen doen. Dat is een examen van 30 vragen. Waarvan je 21 goed moet hebben. En een praktijkexamen. Als in, van die whiskies die je hebt geproefd, krijg je de 4 terug. In een niet bekendgemaakte volgorde. En dan moet je mij vertellen welke whiskies het zijn.
Nou, het klinkt allemaal heel intimiderend. Maar ik kan je vertellen, het is heel goed te doen. Maar het is vooral heel erg leuk.
Kijk.
En dat gaat dus plaatsvinden op maandag 14 maart. Hier op Seamail in Heerlen. Nou, dat is hartstikke leuk. Wil je daar nou meer informatie over? Dan ga je naar elementsofwhisky.nl/ambassador. En dan kom je automatisch op de website terecht van Bob. En dan kun je meteen meer informatie vinden en je aanmelden. En als je dat doet, maar dan moeten we even hopen dat Bob niet meer luistert. Als je invoert Elements of Whisky 5, krijg je ook nog 5% korting. Haha, dat hebben we te goed geregeld voor jullie. Dus als je daarbij wilt zijn en je wilt van Bob alle ins en outs horen over whisky, echt heel veel leren.
En een leuke dag hebben, dat is ook niet onbelangrijk.
En een hele leuke dag hebben, dan ga dan snel naar elementsofwhisky_ambassador. Bob, we zien ons de 14e.
Zeker.
Yeah, so we have 12. And what happens is we will do 12 mashes a week. So it's a balanced system that we have at the distillery, and it works out really well. We will do one mash, and we will put all the liquid from that first mash into washback number 1.
Okay.
And that will sit there for 7 days. And then after that will fill 3 of our 6 wash stills.
Okay.
We will wait until all of the wash stills are empty. So we'll take washback number 1 and washback number 2, and we'll pump them through to the still house, and they'll fill all 6 of our wash stills. And once that's distilled and collected and mixed with the feints and the foreshots from the previous run, that will be enough to fill 4 spirit stills. Wow. So we quite simply, we have as many batches in a week as we have washbacks to facilitate.
Okay.
And that means that we have 12 mashes, 12 distillations if you want every week.
If I take a little look behind the company, like of course we all know behind most whiskey distilleries there's a bigger company, and behind Tomatin there's Takara, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Takara.
And if I'm looking at this, there's only one distillery in Scotland on the list for all their brands, and one of the blended brands that they own is the Antiquary.
Yeah.
If I hear that you guys produce so much volume, where does it all go? Do you keep it all yourself, or?
So this is the thing. I think what's really lovely about Tomatin was in the 1970s. It was the biggest distillery that Scotland had ever seen.
Wow.
It was the biggest malt producing distillery in the world in the 1970s. It had 23 stills producing 12.5 million litres of alcohol a year. Now, that number has been far overtaken nowadays by the likes of Macallan, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Roseisle. All of these distilleries have overtaken it. But we're going back now 50 years, and we were that big. And at that time, everything we were producing was being sold to the blended whiskey industry. But since then, we have totally changed. We've moved away from bulk production to focus on our own brands.
Okay.
So we nowadays have 12 stills. We only use 10 of them. We now only make, I think last year we made 1.6 million litres of alcohol. So although we're a big site, that's not a large amount of single malt. When you look at, it's not a small distillery, but it probably looks at a medium output compared to the rest of the industry. So it's not a huge amount. All of that liquid services our own goals now. So roughly about half of that will be with the intent to go into, I would say maybe 1 million litres of that. The intention is to become Tomatin or Cù Bòcan single malt Scotch whisky.
Okay.
The rest of that, the 600,000 litres, we will use that to trade with other distilleries in order to get the malts and grains that we need to create blends like the Antiquary, like Talisman, like Big T. So everything that we're producing now is to service our own brands.
All right. And that is something maybe that correlates to this. There's one bottle of Tomatin behind me, and it's the 30-year-old. And to be honest with you, I was surprised at how affordable, in brackets, it is for a 30-year-old whiskey. Is this because of that you guys have for like 50 years this big capacity?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, we've not had that big capacity for 50 years. We reached that number in 1974, and then by 1984 we were in liquidation, and that's when we were bought over by Takara Shuzo. So we've done a great job of repatriating stock, and what I mean by that is a lot of the stock that we produced in the 70s and 80s was sold to the blended whiskey industry. Over the last 10 or 20 years, we've done a great job of going out to these companies and being able to get the spirit back. It's been made very easy by the fact that it has been fully matured on site at Tomatin. They paid for the spirit, and they also got the warehouse space. So we've been doing a great job of repatriating that stock and then managing it.
There's one thing that I just really want to ask, and this might be a silly question, but you said like because of this very long fermentation, you give the chance to some other microorganisms to flourish. Are there also some kind of microorganisms that give off flavors, or like flavors that you don't want? And is there any way of controlling it, or is it just like nature that does its thing?
Yeah, so I mean, those microorganisms certainly do exist, and if you ever look at studied bacteria and things like that can be found on barley, in water, there are a plethora of things that we have to control. We do that through temperature, we do that through the mashing process to get rid of a lot of those things. But some of them that exist on the plant are really great and beneficial for flavor. And I think sometimes things that in and of themselves maybe would create a negative flavor, when that's balanced across the mass of the whole, they can actually create really good things. I mean, if you take that to the maturation side of things, oxidation is a great example of that, where you're taking acids and alcohols, breaking them down, bonding them together to create really fruity and floral things. So butyric acid creates, once it's oxidized, will create a lovely banana aroma and things like that. So yes, there are bacteria that will create bad flavors, absolutely. Our job is to control them and make sure that they're working in a way that creates the best flavors. On that yeast point of view, I did say when we started discussing that all of the distillers use loosely a distiller's yeast. With Cù Bòcan in 2019, we did experiment with different yeast varieties. We used a red wine yeast from Australia, and we used a sake yeast from Japan. So the experimentation isn't limited to just the casks that we use here. It's every step of the process we're looking at what can we do different this year. And I think that's why different vintages of Cù Bòcan
will be very interesting.
To see.
We finally have alcohol after fermentation, and then we go to distillation. You've talked about the condensation at a lower temperature. Is that the only difference in the distillation process, or do you change things up more?
Yeah, so between Tomatin and Cù Bòcan, as well as the use of lightly peated barley in Cù Bòcan, for me, one of the biggest and most influential differences on the spirit is where we take the cut point during the second distillation. So we take our 8% ABV wash from the fermentation room.
Mhm.
We'll distill that once through our wash stills, and then we'll fill that into the spirit stills to distill for a second time.
Mhm.
And the cut points where we come from our 4 shots and into our spirit, that remains the same. So we will run the 4 shots for half an hour, and then we'll move to spirit. Now, where Tomatin and Cù Bòcan differ is that with Tomatin, we will take the second cut at 65% ABV. So when you're looking at spirit coming off the still, it comes through from the strongest down to the weakest. It starts off really high strength and then gets weaker.
Okay.
And the higher the strength, the lighter the flavor. So at that high strength, that's where you're going to get, that first half hour, you're going to get really, really kind of estery sorts of things. And then you start to move through this fruits and floral notes and things like that. And the longer you go, the heavier the flavors get. So when we're producing Tomatin, we'll take that cut at 65% ABV, so that the heart of the spirit that we collect is all of these fruity and floral flavors that we want. When we're coming to Cù Bòcan, though, we'll bring that right down to about 60% ABV, so an extra 5%, and that means that we're capturing more of the heavier congeners, more of the phenolic compounds in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much wider spirit cut, and that gives us overall the average spirit is going to be heavier. It's going to have more heavy flavors in it as well, and that married with that richer condensation.
What I'm wondering, right? I've heard this before. Like during a distillation run, the flavors change, and they can change dramatically from the beginning, like from your heart until the end. What I was wondering is, first of all, like I'm not sure if this is possible in a facility or like in a distillery itself, but is there a way to say like, okay, I want to take the first part, like the first half of my heart, and fill it into this cask, and I want to take the second part into another one? Is that possible?
That's a great question. It would require more vessels.
Yeah.
So what you would have to do is, instead of having the 2 cuts where you have your cut from 4 shots into spirit, and then your cut from spirit into faints, with your 4 shots and your faints being discarded and your spirit going on to be matured. Yeah. There's no reason other than kind of capital cost and space and things like that. Yeah. But theoretically, you could, during your spirit run, have spirit
Multiple.
1, spirit 2, spirit 3, as long as you had the vessel to put that first bit into, then put the second bit, and then the third bit. You could theoretically do it. I'm not aware of anyone that has done it. I would be really interested to see if they have done, what the results are. Yeah.
Someone needs to be the first. So take this. You can have this free of charge, no problem. But it was it was just something that I was wondering, because I find that we've talked, like Lucia and I, we've talked in a Dutch episode about distilling and basically explaining the whole process. And we talked with Rutger, and he was a Geneva distiller, and he once demonstrated with distilling coffee that the flavors changed by every glass that he distilled, and he just put them into like a spiral, which remind me on like the top of the cork, and he just like, this is number 7, and you smell it, and it's like this very heavy chocolatey notes, and then you go to like number 12, and it's like this more tobacco notes, and then you go to number 23, like 23 or something, and it's all of a sudden like this very acidic notes. And I was wondering, like, if we're talking about like Cù Bòcan, it's very experimental, and this is something where I'm like, this is where I feel like a distiller makes this very really precise decision of like, here I want to start with my cuts, but then like the whole middle part is just like smushed into this very one thing. And I can imagine that, like as you said, like a very heavy peaty spirit will be more subtle when you put it into new oak. So if you take like the later, like the last parts, maybe this would have like a very surprising impact. And this is something I never see anyone do self as well.
Yeah, I think to go back to the Cù Bòcan spirit, then if we were to take a glass when we first come on spirit, and then take a glass down at that 60% ABV when we come off spirit, you would have 2 very different spirits there. The first one would be incredibly fruity, and the second one would probably be a little bit more earthy and a little bit more smoky. But what we're trying to do within that cut is bring all those flavors together and create something complex. So if you go back to that example with the coffee spirit there, and you've got that chocolatey one and you've got the tobacco one, imagine mixing those all together, the layers that you're going to get in that one spirit. And I think that's what the the distiller's cut aims to do is to identify what's the lightest we want and what's the heaviest we want,
and bring them
then
together.
get them into that one layered spirit.
All right. And we in Scotland, it's usual to do it 2 times, like distilling 2 times. There's one distillery that comes to mind immediately that does it 3 times. But is that something that you guys also would be willing to experiment with, like distilling Cù Bòcan like a second or like a third time?
We wouldn't do it with Cù Bòcan.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that because
it gets too
those
subtle.
phenols, those peat elements, because they are heavier compounds,
Mm-hmm.
the more you distill them, the more you're going to strip them away. And so we already have quite a lightly peated spirit. If we were to distill that a third time, I think you would struggle to pick out any smoke. That's not to say it's not something we would do as a distillery. It's not something we have done, and it would require a little bit of investment in pipework and things to be able to do it. But it's not to say that it's something that we would ever shy away from if we found that there was a reason for doing it. I think one thing that springs to mind, though, is that, as I say, multiple distillation tends to strip away flavour. Yeah. Whereas the market at the moment wants spirits that are
bold,
full of flavour and complex and have depth. So at the moment, I don't think there is a market demand for us to produce an even lighter spirit than we already do.
And then we finally can put it to rest in a wooden cask. And you know, like mentioned, like in the signature, there are 3 casks: bourbon casks, virgin oak cask, and sherry casks. Talk me through it, like bourbon. Where are they from?
Yeah, so the bourbon casks that we are using, we have 2 suppliers of bourbon casks.
Okay.
One of them is the Kelvin Cooperage over in Kentucky.
Okay.
So they are buying casks directly from the bourbon distilleries and sending them over to Scotland. Mm-hmm. The second supplier that we'll use is the Speyside Cooperage over in Scotland. Yep. And that works really well because it means that if there's ever a delay in transport from Kentucky, we can go to the Speyside Cooperage and get them in the same afternoon, which is great for us. When it comes to bourbon casks, this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but we are actually looking for, and I think the reason it's counterintuitive is, you know, when we're talking about our port casks, we're looking at casks that have held port for 50 years, and we want all of those flavors of the port. When it comes to the bourbon casks, the reason we are using those casks is for the American oak influence. Okay. So we're actually looking for casks that have held bourbon for as short a period of time as possible. Yeah. So we're looking at bourbons that have been in the cask for 3 years before they're bottled. Okay. It would be a wonderful marketing thing to say, you know, this whiskey's been matured in Pappy Van Winkle casks or Elijah Craig 18-year-old barrels. But the reality is those casks have already been stripped of the majority of their flavour. Yeah. So we're looking for casks that have held bourbon for 3 years. We want casks that have been naturally seasoned. We don't want kiln-seasoned oak. That's just going to... Kiln-seasoned has a lot more tannin in the wood. So we're wanting naturally seasoned oak. Okay. It's going to be toasted. It's going to be charred before the bourbon producers use it. And then we want a short use of bourbon and then for it to come to the distillery with all of those flavors that we expect from American white oak.
What I'm wondering, and this might be like a little harsh of a comment, but we've been talking about like maturation of whiskey in Scotland, and it's somewhere in the 92 till 98% of all casks in Scotland are currently ex-bourbon casks. Yeah. Majority of the reasons that we as whiskey geeks from the outside think that this is used is because it's a very cheap cask compared to like I can imagine that if you, just a rough estimation, like how many bourbon cask could you buy from the same amount of money that this 50-year-old port cask would cost?
So that's a good way of putting it. So we would probably be able to get about somewhere between 3 and 4 bourbon barrels per port cask.
Wow. Okay.
So a bourbon barrel will cost us between about 120 and 150 pound. Mm-hmm. The port casks will be upwards of 700, maybe 800 pound.
So that's a very good reason to choose bourbon from a financial...
Yeah, but what's really interesting is that red wine casks are cheaper than bourbon barrels at the moment.
Seriously?
So it's not just a cost thing. You know, I think the cost thing is where it stems from. So following Prohibition in the United States, it became law as part of Roosevelt's New Deal that bourbon had to be matured in fresh charred oak casks. Yeah. and then the casks had to be done away with. And in Scotland, much like in the Netherlands, we love a bargain. So it was this idea of, you can get these bourbon barrels at a great price, and let's use them. What's really interesting, that's around about the 1940s.
Okay.
The first record of Tomatin using bourbon barrels was 1911. So bourbon barrels have been used in Scotland for far longer than when they were cheap. Kind of at the start of the 1900s, it kind of goes back to whiskey drinking habits. Throughout the 1800s, a lot of whiskey was drunk in the toddy, that kind of warmed up toddy of drink, and that was benefited by sherry casks. But as we got into the 1900s and started moving into the 1910s and 20s, there was a move towards the highball, and so it was whiskey and soda, or potash, as it was called at the time. And the flavour from American oak benefited that. And so there was already a kind of move towards American oak before bourbon barrels became so much more readily available. I think then your point is absolutely correct. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when whiskey was being made as much as possible to go into blends, American oak was the cheapest. And because the casks that were coming to Scotland had only been used for 3 years, we could use them 2 or 3 times before we had to get rid of them. So there was a huge cost benefit there. But looking at single malt nowadays, for me, I love whiskey matured in bourbon barrels. I love all types of whiskey, but I really enjoy, up to the age of about 15 years old, a first fill bourbon barrel. So for us, it's all about the flavour. It's just a nice benefit that they come at about a quarter of the price of a port or a sherry cask.
All right. And then we got the virgin oak, which is like European oak.
So for signature, it's American oak.
All right. Perfect. Okay. This American virgin oak casks.
Yeah.
And
so we're pretty much hijacking the casks on their way into the bourbon distillery. They're the exact same. They've been toasted and they've been charred.
Okay.
But before the bourbon producer gets them, we buy them.
Right.
And ironically, they actually cost us more than a first fill bourbon barrel will.
But
because we're competing with the bourbon industry.
Of course, and I can imagine, like, this is what you said, like, if we buy a bourbon cask, which has been aged for like 3 years, this rough edge of the cask is off of it. And this virgin oak is just to give this a little bit more, more spice, more punch.
Yeah, so what's really cool is we found that virgin oak casks are really, really good when blended with bourbon casks because they give more depth, they give more concentration of that spice. That said, we've done some tastings of signature where we've done a deconstruction and we've tried. So signature is a minimum of 9 years old. It's a non-age dated product, but it is a minimum of 9 years old. And so all 3 of those components are 9 years old, and we've done deconstruction tastings where we've tried the bourbon cask, the virgin oak cask, and the sherry cask. And 9 times out of 10, the favourite is the virgin oak cask. It's incredible. For me, it's almost like if you imagine what would happen if someone from the west coast of Scotland were to make bourbon. It's got all of the flavours you would expect from a good bourbon, but with that little bit of smoke from a Scotch whiskey.
All right. And the final one is sherry, and we have so many different types of sherry. But what are we talking about? Is it Oloroso? Is it Pigs? Is it Fino? What sherry is it?
Yeah, for signature, it's Oloroso.
All right. And is there a difference between Oloroso sherry from the one winery and from another? Is there a difference between it, or do you say like it's what is? Let me rephrase that. If I'm taking a look at Oloroso, it is a type of sherry, but there are different wine houses that produce them. Is there for you a big difference between them? Or do you say it all gives the same flavors off in a whiskey?
Yeah, so for me, you're touching on now my second passion, which is sherry. And I've been very fortunate to go to Jerez a couple of times with some friends and spend time in the bodegas. And the range of flavors in bodegas in Jerez is parallel to the range of flavors if you were to go from one distillery to another in Scotland. It's different takes on production, different styles of maturation, different blenders doing their thing. It's incredible. I think sherry houses individually, their goal is to create a consistent product using that Solera system. But what one producer's sherry Oloroso might be compared to the guy across the street can be very, very different.
All right. And this combination of like bourbon, virgin oak, and sherry casks is blended. And you already answered like one of the big questions that I got, and it was like discussing the part of like age. I've in my research, I've noticed that there are a lot of people feeling it, classifying it as a younger whiskey, which I feel like automatically happens when there's no age on the bottle. I don't know why, but people always assume that, they're not putting an age on it. It's probably to hide something. Is it to hide something, or what is the reason to call it signature, or instead of like the 9-year-old, or maybe wait a year and call it the 10-year-old or whatever?
Yeah, for us, it is purely freedom.
Okay.
So signature is the only core product in our range.
Mm-hmm.
So there is huge importance on signature being consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, because we're using 3 different cask types, each individual cask is a living, breathing thing, and it will develop at its own time and at its own rate and its own pace.
Okay.
So our job is to create a consistent product, but that's very difficult when the ingredients are all different. So by having a non-age statement, what it allows us to do is, if we've got 1 year where we're saying, actually, this 9-year-old bourbon is a little bit light, we can add in some 10-year-old, we can add in some 12-year-old.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we've got, it tends to happen more often with the virgin oak. If we have a 9-year-old virgin oak and we go, oh, that's powerful, that's a little bit too spicy, we can then put in some 8-year-old if we need to. You know?
Exactly.
So it allows us that freedom, and that's the freedom that we use across the creations. So by having the whole brand as non-age, it gives us so much room. Like I say, with Creation 2, we used 85% of the liquid was from 2012, another 15% was from 2014.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
If we put an age statement on that, we would have to have called it a 6-year-old when the vast majority of it was 8 years old.
Yeah. Okay.
And that gap gets bigger and bigger from different products to another. The Creation 1, the beer casks were from 2006, and the Moscatel was from 2010. So we would be calling a whiskey that was largely 14 years old a 10-year-old, So it just means for us, let the flavor be the focus.
Instead of the age.
If you want to look at that and say it's a non-age statement, I'm going to make a tasting note saying it's young. Okay. Fine, go for it, but go with the flavor first. What does it taste like?
Mm-hmm.
Not does it taste like a young whiskey?
And how transparent?
And is that a bad thing?
No, exactly. No, it's just the thing is like, and how transparent are you about it? Like, for example, like if somebody would like go to Instagram and send you guys a DM like, hey, I've bought this bottle and I was wondering like what are the ages? Is it something that you guys can share, or is it something that you say like we are legally obliged to say, sorry, we can't?
We will 100% share it. So I think, if you go back to the compass box thing about the age and transparency, it was under EU law that they weren't allowed to say the ages of the products in the bottle unless that information was requested. And that's where they got to. Yeah. So if you come to us and say, I want to know what's in this, we will tell you the exact percentages of each cask used. We will tell you what vintage they were from. We'll give you more information than you possibly thought was imaginable.
Yes.
We just can't put it on the carton.
Yeah.
Now, if you come to a tasting with me, a Cù Bòcan tasting, I'll give you all of that information right there and then.
Sure.
I think what's difficult is with a product like this, we rely heavily on the retailer to convey the message of the product to the consumer. And they do a fantastic job. Retailers around the world are fantastic. But I think it's unreasonable to expect a retailer to understand the exact percentages of this and then go and sell another 100 products as well. It's easy for us to do because this is our brand. We know how it was made.
Yeah.
So, but if you come to us and ask the question, we'll give the answer.
So that's also a shout out to everyone listening. Like if you buy like the new Creations 3 or 4, just send a message or an email or whatever. And I got a feeling that they really liked you to answer everything that you asked them. There was one thing, there's this one word which I always am intrigued about when distillers or people working at a distillery say, and it's modern. Because the thing is, like, I feel like whiskey is something that, for a lot of people at least, is something that evokes emotions and relies heavily on this very big nostalgic feeling about how the distillery came to be and the rich history and stuff. So hearing the word modern always is like, okay, so we are changing some things up. And you mentioned like modern maturation. Yeah. What is it?
So yeah, I think it's a great question, because in reality, the vast majority of whiskey casks that are being used today were used 100 years ago at some point. Mm-hmm. So what I'm keen to do is separate the word modern for innovative, because in whiskey, there's not a lot of innovation. I would say, using Japanese shochu casks, that was truly innovative. It was the first time it happened. We had them in stock, and then the law changed, which allowed us to use them. That's innovation. That's modern. I think it's the mindset. Okay. So the things that we're doing today by using different cask types, that's happened for 150 years. Yeah. We look at warehouse books from 100 years ago. There's cognac casks in there. There's port casks in there. It's celebrating that's modern. 100 years ago, there was never a mention of cask type on the bottle and the influence of that. Until about the 1980s, all you ever heard people talking about was why the water source made the whiskey different. And we now know that that's not true. So what it is, it's not so much that the practice has changed, it's the celebration of it and the focus of it. What I would say is new about what we're doing is that we are marrying those flavors together. It's that final part, it's the marriage. We're using casks that have been used for 100 years, but we're taking the information that we've learned from that, and we're then going, what's the next step? Sherry casks are lovely. But what happens when you mix them with a bourbon barrel? That was something that was asked 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's now pretty much the core of all 10 and 12-year-old single malts in the market is a mix of bourbon and sherry. We're just taking that and then looking at casks that maybe haven't had that question asked about them. And I think that's what's modern about it. Okay. But it's still, that is only possible, that mindset is only possible with a full appreciation of the history and what's gone before.
There are two quick questions, because the thing is, when you're talking with somebody as passionate as you, Scott, you tend to forget about the time, which happens to me quite too often. So there are two quick questions. The first one probably won't be a quick answer, but you mentioned that the distillery is located way higher than regular distilleries in Scotland. We've talked about maturation a lot, but this increase of altitude, how does it involve maturation? Is there a higher angel share? Is there a lower angel share? Is there quicker or slower? Like, what is happening at your altitude?
I think the first thing to point out is that we mature everything that we produce on site at the distillery. Okay. So we don't really have a comparison at sea level, So everything that we produce is matured on site. So all I can talk about is that in itself. I can't say how that would compare. What I can say is that at the distillery, our angel share is between 1 and 1.5%. 1 and 1.5% a year, where the industry kind of averages between 1.5% and 2%. So it's a lower angel share. Okay. And what we have found is that we really benefit from long periods of maturation. Because of our location, we are able to execute long maturation really, really well. And it means that we have this wonderful process of oxidation. And so if you try older whiskies from our distillery, they don't just taste like something that's been in wood for 30 years. Nope. They are vibrant, they're vivacious, and it's because the distillery benefits from that longer, slower maturation.
And the final question, at least about the distillery, we've heard quite often that if you take a still and you run peated spirit to it or a peated wash through it, that in the next few runs there still might be a little bit of the smokiness into your final product. Is it something that you encounter with like the first runs of the year from Tomatin?
So the reason that's happening is it's not necessarily that the still's got a residue inside it or whatnot. It's the foreshots and the feints. Okay. And it's that second distillation. So in the second distillation, you are taking the liquid from the first distillation, but you're also marrying that with the foreshots and the feints from the previous spirits distillation. Mm-hmm. So if you get to the end of a run of peated production and your foreshots and your feints are put to the side, and they've got they have a smoky base, and then you take the distillation from the wash still of your non-peated and you marry that together, there will be that element. And we call it like the shoulders and the head. So we have the shoulders going in where the first couple of runs of Cù Bòcan have foreshots and feints from the last Tomatin run. This year, though, what we have done is we have run the foreshots and feints right down so that when we got to Cù Bòcan, we were starting with 100% that peated base. And I believe we've done it at the other end as well, so that when we go back onto Tomatin, we're starting 100% at Tomatin. Okay. That will mean that we incur losses because we're having to get rid of that spirit or that by spirit. But it does mean that we have a very clear Cù Bòcan Tomatin split.
Perfect. I was just wondering that. And I wanted to end this whole chat with a question directly to you. If you were in charge of creations 5 and 6 and you could make anything you would want, what would it be?
You'll have to wait and see. You should try creation 3 and 4 first.
No, but what are things like you've been working with this brand for so close and so much, but like what are things that you would like to experiment with, or like what are casks types, or what like things that interest you personally? It doesn't have to be into like creation 5 or 6, but it's just what would you do? So
I guess a better way to answer that, I'm driven by the spirit at the time of blending. Okay. I've got no preconceived notions going in as to what we want to create. Really what we will do every time it comes to creating Cù Bòcan is we will draw samples from all the variety of casks that we have. We'll sample them, we'll make our notes, and then we'll start mixing them and we'll find the right thing at that time. Okay. So I think a better way of answering that question is to tell you about the casks that we have maturing that excite me for the future. Okay. Not necessarily what it will become, but we recently purchased some Colombian oak from the Andes Mountains. Okay. It's a different type of oak species. It's called Quercus humboldtii or something to that effect. My Latin's not great.
I think really that no one watching is very good at Latin currently, so you're safe.
No. So really excited to see how that develops. Uh-huh. We also secured a parcel of 10 ice wine casks from a producer over in Canada, so I'm really excited to see what ice wine casks with a lightly peated spirit will do. Mm-hmm. We have some lovely Palo Cortado casks from Jerez. Oh, wow. So I'm really excited to see those. So it's really, what excites me is looking at the stock sheet and going, one day these are going to be incredible. Yes. Is that going to be in time for creation 5 and 6? I don't know. No problem. I love it when the casks come together and create not just a wonderful whiskey, but a great story as well. So creation 3 is a great example of that. Yes, exactly. The liquid, the whiskey itself is wonderful, and then it allows us to evoke that image of that Moroccan experience. So it's nice to have both elements, but at its core, the whiskey has to be good first.
And that's a very nice way to end this episode.
Please listen carefully.
Ja, dat was hem alweer. Batch nummer 8. Yes! Nou, daarom betekent dat volgende keer zitten we alweer in batch 9. En wat komt na 9?
10!
Precies, en dat is wel heel bijzonder dat we onze 10e batch al halen. En daar hebben we een paar leuke ideeën voor. Maar Lucia, wat is ons podcastabonnement eigenlijk? Want...
Ja, wat zijn deze batches? Nou, wij hebben elke 6 weken een nieuwe batch met 6 whiskies. Die bespreken we hier, die proeven wij. Maar jij thuis hebt de kans om die ook te proeven. Elke 6 weken krijg je dan 6 van deze buisjes. Uiteraard wel gevuld met whisky.
Heel belangrijk.
En kun je lekker met ons meeproeven voor slechts €29,99. Hoe leuk is dat?
Nou, het is super vet. Maar ik heb een leuke actie. Want
echt?
Als jij in batch 9 hebben we nou een bonusprogramma dat je vrienden kunt uitnodigen. Dus als zij zich aanmelden op adamsonwhisky.nl/podcast, dan hebben ze de mogelijkheid om een naam in te vullen wie hun getipt heeft op de podcastabonnement. Als ze jouw naam invullen, krijg jij €10 korting.
Dus als 3 vrienden jouw naam invullen,
dan krijg je een gratis badge.
Gratis badge.
Precies.
Oh.
En dat doen we alleen speciaal in batch nummer 9. Zodat voor batch 10. Op die manier hopen we dat we dat grote speciale badge wat we in petto hebben, dat we dat met zoveel mogelijk whisky-liefhebbers kunnen delen. Dus heb jij minimaal 3 vrienden? Of heb je 6 vrienden? Of heb je 1 vriend? Maakt niet uit. Je krijgt €10 korting per persoon die jouw naam invult op het formulier bij adamsonwhisky.nl/podcast.
Precies.
Nou, dus ja, ik heb er zin in.
Ik ook. Ik heb wel 3 vrienden.
Ik heb misschien 3 vrienden die dat willen. Nee. Hey, ontzettend leuk. Wij zien jullie graag voor volgende week terug bij Batch 9.
Doei doei!